A single gesture inside a crowded lobby shattered the illusion of control that a powerful company had carefully built. No one expected it to matter, yet that moment peeled back layers of arrogance and exposed truths that could no longer be ignored. What began as a quiet act of kindness became the spark that set an empire trembling. Like this story if it grips you, subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments what you think and where you're watching from. Derek Coleman, a 25-year-old black intern, carried a tray of coffees across the marble lobby of Whitaker and Amp, Ross Corporation. The building was a towering glass monument to wealth and power, designed to impress clients the moment they stepped inside. But for Derek, it was a place that reminded him daily of his small place in a giant machine. His internship had been 3 months of long hours, low pay, and endless demands to stay invisible. He knew his role: bring coffee, copy files, and smile politely while executives barely remembered his name. But as he walked past the receptionist's desk, careful not to spill the hot drinks, he noticed something that stopped him in his tracks. A middle-aged man in a fine suit stood at the counter, his hands moving quickly, his face tense with urgency. The receptionist tilted her head with irritation, arms crossed, her voice sharp. "I don't know what you're trying to say, sir. You'll need to wait." The man tried again, gesturing faster now, desperation flickering in his eyes. To everyone else, it looked like chaos, but Derek recognized immediately what he was doing. He was signing. The man was deaf, trying to communicate in American Sign Language, but no one in that pristine lobby understood him. The receptionist's tone grew more dismissive, her words dripping with disdain. "You'll need an interpreter. Until then, you're wasting my time." Her voice carried, echoing off the marble floors, and people glanced over only to look away quickly, unwilling to get involved. The man's shoulders dropped, his movements slowed, and Derek saw something he knew well: the defeated posture of someone who had been excluded too many times before. Derek froze for a moment, gripping the tray tightly, his heart hammering in his chest. He knew the rules of this place. Don't draw attention, don't step out of line, don't act like you matter. He had lived under those rules not only in this corporate tower but in the world outside, where being black often meant being underestimated before you opened your mouth. He could walk on, deliver the coffee, and let the moment pass like everyone else was doing. But his conscience twisted against the idea, and the burn in his chest grew hotter with every second he hesitated. He remembered his younger cousin, also deaf, struggling in school when teachers wouldn't slow down or acknowledge his needs. He remembered translating for him at family dinners and the way his cousin's face lit up whenever someone bothered to truly listen. The memory became an anchor that rooted Derek in place, forcing him to act. With a steady breath, he carefully set the coffee tray down on a nearby side table, each motion deliberate, like a soldier preparing for battle. His eyes met the man's, and in that instant, Derek saw something he couldn't walk away from: a silent plea for dignity. His hands began to move almost on their own, forming words in American Sign Language with practiced ease. "Can I help you? What do you need?" he signed. For a heartbeat, the man just stared, eyes widening with shock, and then his expression cracked open into relief so pure it was like a light had been turned on inside him. His hands flew as he replied, his gestures fast but clear, filled with urgency. Derek matched his pace, his own hands flowing confidently, and for the first time since the man had entered the lobby, he was being understood. The change in atmosphere was immediate. The scattered conversations died away, footsteps slowed, and employees turned their heads one by one to witness what was unfolding. The black intern they had overlooked for weeks was suddenly commanding the room without a word spoken aloud. People watched in stunned silence as Derek translated fluently, his movements sharp, graceful, and confident. The receptionist blinked in disbelief, her smug dismissal unraveling as her ignorance became visible to everyone present. A couple of junior employees pulled out their phones, recording clips they thought they could joke about later, not realizing the footage would instead serve as undeniable proof of Derek's skill. Across the lobby, a veteran security guard leaned forward, his sharp eyes locked on Derek. He had worked in this building for decades and thought he had seen everything. But there was something about this moment, about this young black intern stepping into the silence with quiet courage, that made him pause. It was as if he sensed the small crack forming in the company's polished facade, one that could widen into something larger. Meanwhile, a red light blinked steadily on the black dome of the security camera mounted overhead. Its lens caught everything: the receptionist's scowl, the visitor's relief, the employees staring, and Derek's hands moving with the precision of someone who had spent years mastering the language of the overlooked. The man's posture straightened as hope replaced defeat. He signed quickly. "Thank you. I thought no one here would understand me." Derek Coleman stood there in the center of the Whitaker and Amp Ross lobby, his hands moving with the kind of fluid confidence that only came from years of practice. And as he signed to the deaf visitor, he realized that the atmosphere around him had shifted into something heavier, charged with curiosity and judgment, every gaze pulling toward him as though no one in the building had ever expected an intern, especially a young black intern, to take control of a situation that the official staff had failed to handle. The man in the suit signed back quickly, his gestures sharp, crisp, and overflowing with relief, and Derek matched him effortlessly, almost forgetting for a moment that the receptionist and half the lobby were staring like he had just broken an unspoken law. "Thank you," the man signed. "I thought no one would help me," Derek responded without hesitation. "You're welcome, sir. Please tell me what you need, and I'll help make sure it is heard." The man explained that he was here for an important meeting regarding accessibility and inclusion projects, but without proper communication, he feared his ideas would never even reach the right ears. And hearing that struck Derek deeply, because he knew how easy it was for voices like theirs to be ignored in places like this, voices drowned out by arrogance and bureaucracy. As they signed, Derek laughed lightly at one of the man's expressions, and the sound carried unexpectedly through the lobby, warm and genuine, drawing startled looks from employees unused to hearing anything but stiff professionalism in that sterile environment. A hush had settled, but whispers began at the edges, murmurs of astonishment, irritation, or even admiration, and Derek felt the weight of those whispers press against his back. He caught sight of two junior employees pointing their phones at him, recording, perhaps to laugh later or perhaps out of sheer disbelief, and he wondered fleetingly how quickly a moment like this could spin out of his control. But he pushed the thought aside because the man in front of him mattered more. The visitor straightened his shoulders as Derek translated his concerns clearly, and though the receptionist squirmed in her seat and tried to look busy on her computer, the tension in her jaw betrayed her embarrassment. She had dismissed the man as a nuisance, but Derek had reframed him as a person of importance, a client whose needs deserved recognition, and the contrast between her indifference and his competence was not lost on those watching. The veteran security guard continued to observe from his post, arms crossed but eyes sharp, and Derek sensed the man's silent approval, though no words were spoken. The blinking camera overhead documented every frame, an impartial witness to the subtle power struggle that was unfolding, and Derek began to realize that what felt like an instinctive act of kindness was turning into something larger than himself. The man signed more quickly now, explaining details of his meeting, and Derek translated aloud for those nearby, his voice steady, his tone respectful. "He is here to discuss a major partnership on accessibility," Derek said, "and he wants to make sure this company is truly committed." Gasps and murmurs rippled across the lobby, and Derek understood why the visitor wasn't just anyone. He was someone important, someone whose presence could shift fortunes and reputations, and suddenly Derek's decision to step forward had implications he hadn't anticipated. He kept his face calm, refusing to let nerves show, but his thoughts raced as he realized the magnitude of what he had stumbled into. Yet even in that pressure, he felt strangely certain, because for the first time in weeks he wasn't just a coffee runner, he was doing something that mattered. The visitor signed again, this time with gratitude, complimenting Derek's fluency, and Derek translated faithfully but added his own smile, a small human touch that made the man chuckle. The laugh felt like a spark of humanity cutting through the corporate chill, and Derek felt pride swelling in his chest, a pride he rarely allowed himself in this place. Around them, people exchanged looks, some impressed, some unsettled, some envious, and Derek knew instinctively that not everyone would react with kindness. There were those who would see his actions as noble, but others, especially those clinging to their fragile authority, would see it as a threat. He could feel it like a storm cloud building behind him. But he didn't back down, and when the visitor placed his hand briefly on Derek's arm in a gesture of thanks, Derek nodded solemnly, recognizing the bond they had formed in mere minutes. "You don't need to apologize for being kind," the man signed, and Derek translated his words clearly for all to hear, watching as discomfort rippled through the crowd. The receptionist shifted again, and Derek caught her glare, a silent vow that she would remember this humiliation. Still, he stood tall, knowing he had made the right choice. Derek Coleman still felt the heat of dozens of stares pressing into his back as he signed with calm precision for the visitor. His body language steady, even though inside his chest, his heart thudded against his ribs. The lobby had gone from buzzing chatter to hushed silence, and in that silence, a shift of power was already taking shape. Derek thought he had simply stepped forward to help someone in need, but he didn't realize that his act of courage had drawn the attention of someone who could alter the course of his entire life. Richard Whitaker, the CEO of Whitaker and Amp, Ross, had just stepped out of the executive elevator at the far side of the lobby. He was a tall man with a sharp jawline and silver hair cut with military precision, his reputation as ruthless as it was legendary. People often said he could dismantle an executive with a single look, that his gray eyes seemed able to pierce through the lies of anyone who dared stand before him. This morning, instead of being surrounded by assistants and board members, he was alone, his arrival quiet and unnoticed by most, but his gaze had locked on Derek the moment the intern raised his hands to sign. He stood motionless near a group of clients, blending in like a shadow, observing with the patience of a man who had learned long ago that the most important truths reveal themselves when people believe they are unobserved. Derek continued signing fluently, interpreting with his voice as needed, unaware that those gray eyes were dissecting every gesture, every word, every flicker of expression. For Richard Whitaker, used to superficial politeness and empty ambition, this scene was like a spark in dry grass. He saw something different in this young black intern. Something he hadn't seen in years: courage without calculation, empathy without agenda, competence without arrogance. But Whitaker wasn't the only one watching closely. Across the lobby, Evelyn Drake, head of the marketing department, narrowed her eyes as she leaned against the glass railing. She had built her career not on talent but on politics, mastering the art of keeping others down to make herself appear taller. For someone like Evelyn, genuine competence was more than unsettling, it was dangerous. She watched Derek command the attention of the room with nothing but kindness and skill, and the sight lit a fire of resentment inside her. The idea of an intern, especially a black intern, becoming the center of admiration in the middle of her carefully controlled domain made her pulse race with fury. Her mind spun rapidly, already calculating how to turn this small act into a weapon against him, how to remind everyone of their place. Derek felt the change in the air, though he couldn't yet pinpoint its source. He knew the whispers were not all supportive. He sensed a current of hostility weaving through the crowd, the kind that always emerged when someone broke an unspoken rule. His fingers moved steadily, translating as the visitor explained his business. But in the corner of his vision, he noticed one of his fellow interns, a timid young woman named Claire, stepping toward him nervously. She whispered, "Derek, you should stop. This isn't your job." Her voice trembled with fear, not for herself, but for him, because she knew that defiance of protocol, no matter how noble, was rarely rewarded in places like this. Derek glanced at her briefly, his eyes steady, and in that single look, she seemed to understand that he had already made his choice. He was not backing down. He turned back to the visitor, his hands fluid, his posture straight. Claire stopped mid-step, her words dying in her throat, because she realized he wasn't being reckless, he was being resolute. The receptionist shifted uncomfortably in her chair, trying to appear unaffected, but her clenched jaw betrayed her frustration. She had wanted to dismiss the man quietly, file him away like a problem too insignificant to matter, and now her indifference had been laid bare for all to see. The employees who had been drawn in by curiosity lingered, some folding their arms in irritation, others watching with reluctant admiration. Derek knew he had crossed a line, but something inside him hardened instead of faltering. He had spent too many years being told to stay small, too many times swallowing disrespect, too many moments walking away when he wanted to speak up. This time, he chose differently. He didn't know that Richard Whitaker had seen every second, that the man who built his empire on calculated judgment was standing just a few feet away, watching with a rare intensity that made his assistants nervous whenever they recognized it. Whitaker's mind was already moving, not just noting Derek's fluency, but the quiet authority with which he handled the room. Where others saw rebellion, Whitaker saw leadership. Where others saw a breach of protocol, he saw initiative. But Evelyn Drake saw only a threat, and her narrow gaze promised retaliation. She straightened, her heels clicking as she turned sharply, her mind already plotting the scene she would stage to cut Derek back down to size. She had humiliated interns before, and she would do it again. The security guard near the door, still watching with his arms crossed, noticed Evelyn's expression and muttered under his breath, though no one heard him. "Careful, boy," he whispered softly, his eyes still on Derek. Derek Coleman felt the energy of the lobby shift again, but this time it was not the quiet awe of people witnessing something unexpected. It was a sudden sharpness cutting through the silence like glass shattering, and the source of it came in the form of Evelyn Drake's heels clicking across the polished marble floor with deliberate rhythm. She moved like someone who believed every step was a declaration of power, her chin raised, her smile tight and cruel, her eyes locked on Derek as though he were prey that had dared to step out of line. The whispers in the crowd quieted at once as they sensed the collision about to unfold, and Derek braced himself, though his hands still moved with calm precision as he finished translating the visitor's words. Evelyn's voice sliced through the air, mocking and sharp, carrying across the entire lobby so that no one could pretend not to hear. "Well, isn't this adorable?" she sneered, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "An intern playing interpreter? Coffee runs not exciting enough for you, Coleman?" Her words were meant to belittle, to shrink him back down to the box she believed he belonged in. But Derek's face stayed calm even as heat flushed under his skin. The visitor frowned, clearly sensing the hostility in her voice, though he could not hear the venom in her tone. And Derek instinctively signed to him, "It's okay. Don't worry," even as Evelyn pressed closer, her heels striking like hammers against the floor. She stopped a few feet away, tilting her head with mock pity, her eyes glinting with malice. "You do realize we have protocols, don't you? Interns are not qualified to interpret for clients. That's why we have professionals, not children trying to show off." Her words were a weapon, aimed not only at Derek but at the perception of him in front of everyone else. The receptionist smirked behind her desk, her earlier irritation now curling into satisfaction as she saw Evelyn take control of the scene. A few employees chuckled nervously, eager to side with power, while others looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Derek swallowed hard, his mind racing, but he steadied his voice as he replied, "I was only helping because he needed assistance." His tone was respectful but firm, the kind that tried to de-escalate, but Evelyn wasn't interested in peace. She let out a sharp laugh that echoed across the lobby. "Helping?" she repeated, twisting the word into an insult. "You've been here, what, 3 months? And you already think you're indispensable? How ambitious of you." The word ambitious rolled off her tongue like poison, turning what should have been a compliment into an accusation. Derek translated quickly for the deaf visitor, his hands still moving even as his chest tightened, not wanting the man to feel left out of the exchange. The visitor frowned deeper, signing to Derek, "You don't need to apologize for being kind. You did nothing wrong." Derek's heart swelled at the words, and he spoke them aloud as he translated, letting everyone in the lobby hear them. "He says I don't need to apologize for being kind. He says I did nothing wrong." The impact was immediate, subtle, but real. Some of the gathered employees shifted uncomfortably, their faces betraying that Evelyn's cruelty was unnecessary, even shameful. A few lowered their gazes, no longer amused. Evelyn's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her sneer. "How dramatic," she said loudly, rolling her eyes for effect. "This isn't about kindness, Coleman. This is about knowing your place. And your place is not here, playing hero in front of clients." She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to make it sting, but still loud enough for the surrounding crowd to hear. "You think a few hand gestures will impress anyone important? No one here is fooled." The receptionist stifled a laugh, covering her mouth, and Derek caught the flicker of satisfaction in her eyes, but he also noticed something else. A few employees looked directly at Evelyn now, not with admiration, but with thinly veiled contempt. They weren't siding with Derek yet, but they weren't laughing with her either. Derek took a breath, the kind that steadied him before he spoke, and he looked Evelyn directly in the eyes. "With respect, Miss Drake," he said, his voice low but clear, "I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was trying to make sure a guest was treated with dignity." The words landed like a pebble in a pond, sending ripples of discomfort across the silent lobby. Evelyn's nostrils flared, and she forced a laugh. "Dignity," she repeated, the sarcasm thick. "You really do think highly of yourself, don't you? You're an intern, Coleman. You bring coffee, you make copies, and you stay invisible until someone decides you're worth noticing. That's how this world works, and the sooner you accept it, the better. The visitor's eyes darkened at her words, and he tapped Derek's arm to sign quickly, his hands moving with agitation. She doesn't understand what this means, but you do. Derek signed back, steady, reassuring, then translated aloud. He says you don't understand what this means, but I do. Evelyn froze for half a second, her mouth opening then closing as she tried to regain control. Enough, she snapped. Coleman, you've wasted enough of everyone's time. Return to your actual responsibilities before you embarrass yourself further. But Derek didn't step back. Instead, he turned to the visitor with deliberate grace, ignoring Evelyn's glare, and signed clearly, Sir, it was an honor to assist you. I hope your meeting today goes exactly as you planned. The man's face broke into a genuine smile, and his hands moved quickly in return. Derek laughed softly, then interpreted aloud. He says he rarely meets someone who communicates so naturally, and he has a meeting scheduled with the CEO about an accessibility project. The lobby of Whitaker and AMP. Ross remained frozen in silence after the deaf visitor revealed through Derek's interpretation that he was there to meet with the CEO about an accessibility project. And in that moment, Evelyn Drake's mocking smile faltered, though she tried to hide it with another sharp laugh. Derek Coleman felt the weight of the room press against him, as if every executive, employee, and bystander were now recalibrating their perception of what had just unfolded, and though his heart raced, his face stayed calm as his hands moved fluidly to continue interpreting for the visitor. The man signed quickly, his gestures strong and decisive, and Derek translated aloud, his voice carrying clearly across the marble lobby. He says he has full authority to approve or cancel a multi-million-dollar partnership, and that the way he has been treated here will determine how this company proceeds. Gasps rippled through the onlookers, and a nervous murmur spread like wildfire, because suddenly what had looked like an amusing clash between an intern and a department head was revealed to be something with financial stakes so high that no one could ignore it. Derek caught the shift immediately, saw how faces that had been smirking moments earlier now turned pale, saw how eyes that had dismissed him now followed every movement of his hands with fearful attention. Evelyn's face tightened, her eyes darting to the receptionist as if blaming her, then back to Derek with venom, but beneath the fury was something new, panic. She had meant to humiliate him, but instead she had exposed herself as cruel and short-sighted in front of someone who could alter the company's future with a single decision. Derek steadied his breathing, realizing that his decision to act had not only given the visitor dignity, but had also pulled back the curtain on the corporation's shallow professionalism. Still, he knew this moment was dangerous. Humiliation made people like Evelyn desperate, and desperation could make them reckless. The visitor signed again, slower this time, his expression filled with gratitude as well as conviction, and Derek felt a swell of pride as he interpreted faithfully. He says it is rare to find someone who not only understands his language, but respects his presence. He says he will not forget this. The words cut across the lobby, heavy with meaning, and for the first time, Derek saw respect flicker in the eyes of some executives who had never spoken a word to him before. The receptionist, suddenly realizing the gravity of her earlier dismissal, shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her face flushing as whispers rose among the employees watching. Derek noticed a few glances cast her way, not with admiration but with judgment, and though she tried to keep her eyes on her computer, the damage had already been done. Evelyn straightened her shoulders, forcing confidence back into her posture, and snapped, "Well, I am sure Mr. Whitaker will arrange for a proper interpreter for your meeting." Her voice was sharp, her attempt at control brittle, and Derek translated the words calmly to the visitor, though the bitterness behind them was obvious to everyone listening. Before Derek could say anything else, the visitor shook his head firmly, signing with deliberate authority, "I already found the interpreter I need." Derek's chest tightened with shock as he translated those words aloud, and the lobby erupted with another wave of murmurs. Disbelief mingled with a strange sense of vindication. Some employees leaned forward as if they couldn't quite believe their ears, while others looked at Derek with new eyes. Their earlier assumptions about him dissolving in the face of undeniable competence. Evelyn's composure cracked visibly now, her lips tightening as her fists clenched at her sides. Derek kept his expression neutral, but inside he felt a surge of pride, not arrogance, but a deep satisfaction that the kindness he had offered was not only recognized, but valued. He looked at the visitor, whose smile was genuine, whose eyes conveyed trust. And Derek nodded slightly in acknowledgement, feeling a bond forming that was stronger than any words. He knew, however, that this public recognition came with risk. In a world where he was expected to remain invisible, being seen this brightly was dangerous. He could already sense the lines of battle being drawn. Some in the lobby admired him, some resented him, and Evelyn would not let this go unchallenged. Yet he stood tall, his shoulders squared, his hands steady. Because once you choose to step forward, retreat is no longer an option. The visitor signed again, and Derek interpreted. He says he is looking forward to discussing the future of accessibility with this company, but that how the employees treat people like him will decide everything. The sentence landed like a verdict, and Derek saw fear flash in the eyes of executives who knew their reputations, their bonuses, and perhaps their careers could be tied to what had just been exposed in this lobby. For Derek, the recognition was exhilarating but sobering. He hadn't acted to impress anyone. He had simply refused to walk away from injustice. But now, because of that refusal, he had become central to something far larger than he had ever anticipated. He realized the visitor's recognition was not just about his fluency in sign language, but about his courage to act where others had chosen silence. And in that realization, Derek felt a new clarity settle over him. The tension in the lobby had reached its peak. The silence so thick it felt like a tangible wall pressing against Derek Coleman's chest. And just as Evelyn Drake tried to collect herself after the deaf visitor insisted Derek was the interpreter he needed, a deep, commanding voice cut through the atmosphere like a blade slicing fabric, calm yet absolute in its authority, a voice everyone in Whitaker and AMP, Ross knew by heart. "Actually," the voice said, "I believe we have already found the perfect interpreter." Every head in the lobby turned at once, and there stood Richard Whitaker, the CEO himself, tall and imposing, his silver hair catching the light, his gray eyes focused directly on Derek. And in that instant, the balance of the room shifted again, this time permanently. Evelyn paled, her mask of confidence faltering as she stammered, "Mr. Whitaker, I was just..." But he silenced her with a single look, the kind that had dismantled board members and silenced entire rooms. He stepped closer to Derek and the visitor, his presence radiating power. But there was something else in his gaze too, something softer, an intensity that suggested this moment carried a personal weight. "Come with me," he said evenly, addressing both the visitor and Derek. "We have a meeting to attend." The crowd parted like water as the three walked toward the executive elevator, and though Derek's pulse thundered in his ears, he kept his expression steady, refusing to betray the storm inside. As the doors closed behind them, muffling the buzz of whispers outside, Derek realized he was now standing beside the man who could make or break his future in seconds. The elevator ascended, the silence heavy until the visitor broke it with swift signs, his hands sharp, his face determined. Derek translated smoothly. He says his name is Miguel Alvarez, and he is the founder of the National Accessibility Network. He says this meeting is to evaluate whether your company deserves to be a partner in their largest project yet. Whitaker nodded, his expression unreadable, but Derek caught the slight flicker in his eyes, a recognition of the stakes. When the doors opened to the executive floor, the three walked into Whitaker's private conference room, a space lined with glass walls and panoramic views of the city skyline, the kind of room designed to remind everyone who entered it of their insignificance. But Derek didn't feel insignificant. Not anymore. Whitaker gestured for them to sit, his movements precise, controlled. As they settled, Whitaker finally spoke, his voice quieter now, more deliberate. "Mr. Alvarez, Mr. Coleman," he said, pausing briefly on Derek's name as though testing its weight. "I should tell you something before we begin. What just happened downstairs was not lost on me. I saw every moment." Derek's stomach clenched, but he forced himself to meet the CEO's eyes, prepared for whatever judgment would come. Whitaker leaned forward, folding his hands on the table, and his voice dropped lower, almost personal. "My daughter, Sarah, was deaf. She passed away 3 years ago, but before she died, she taught me enough sign language to understand simple conversations. I understood what was said in that lobby, every word, every insult, every act of kindness. Do you understand me, Coleman?" Derek froze, the weight of those words hitting him with the force of a tidal wave. The man who held the keys to his future had not only witnessed his defiance, but had also personally felt the sting of Evelyn's cruelty because he understood the language she had mocked. "Yes, sir. Derek said quietly, his throat tight but his posture steady. Miguel Alvarez placed his hand gently on Derek's arm, signing with deliberate care, and Derek translated, "He says he is deeply sorry for your loss, and he understands now why this project matters to you." Whitaker's eyes softened for a brief moment, his composure cracking just enough to reveal the grief that still lived behind his stern exterior. "Sarah always told me that communication is more than words," he said, his voice rougher now. "She told me that the people who truly understand don't just translate, they connect souls. What I saw you do downstairs, Coleman, that was exactly what she meant." Derek felt his chest tighten, a mix of sorrow and pride flooding him, but he kept his face composed, aware that this moment was not only about recognition but about trust. Miguel signed again, his gestures confident, and Derek spoke. "He says that what you saw today is what he has always wanted from corporate partners, genuine respect, not empty gestures. He says if this company chooses to honor that, the partnership could change lives nationwide." Whitaker's eyes flickered between the two men, and Derek sensed his decision forming, not just about the project, but about him personally. After a long silence, Whitaker leaned back, his gaze fixed squarely on Derek. "Coleman," he said, "I want you to join us for this meeting. Not as an intern, but as a participant. You've already proven you are the interpreter we need." The words hit Derek like a thunderclap, and though he kept his posture straight, inside his mind reeled at the enormity of the moment. He had stepped forward out of instinct, and now he was being invited into the highest room of power. Evelyn's scornful words about knowing his place echoed faintly in his memory, but they no longer held weight. Whitaker had just redefined his place with a single sentence. Miguel smiled and signed his approval, and Derek translated it with a steady voice, though his heart pounded harder than ever. "He says he agrees. He says you should let this young man lead, because he has already shown what true inclusion means." Whitaker gave the slightest nod, the kind of acknowledgement that in his world was equivalent to applause. Derek understood then that this was not just about a project or even about language, it was about legacy. For Whitaker, it was about honoring the memory of his daughter by building something lasting. For Miguel, it was about ensuring corporate partners lived up to their promises. And for Derek, it was about proving that he was more than what the world had tried to reduce him to, more than the invisible intern fetching coffee. Derek Coleman sat at the polished conference table in Richard Whitaker's private boardroom, the city skyline stretching beyond the floor to ceiling glass behind him, and though the gravity of being included in a CEO-level meeting pressed down on his shoulders, he kept his posture composed, his hands ready, his mind sharper than ever. Miguel Alvarez signed with steady confidence as he outlined his accessibility initiative, describing in vivid detail how companies had failed for decades to address the needs of people with disabilities, how token gestures had replaced genuine inclusion, and how Whitaker and AMP, Ross had the opportunity to lead by example instead of lagging behind. Derek translated every word with precision, his voice calm and clear, and while he spoke, Whitaker studied him not just as an interpreter, but as a strategist. Watching how Derek managed the flow of conversation with the authority of someone far beyond an intern, yet beneath Derek's calm exterior, a storm brewed, because he knew what Evelyn Drake would do next. He had seen it before in smaller ways, how supervisors who felt threatened resorted to sabotage, how they whispered behind closed doors, how they crafted narratives designed to bury people like him under labels of arrogance or insubordination. He had spent 3 months anticipating this very moment, and unlike Evelyn, he had prepared. When Miguel paused to let his words sink in, Whitaker leaned forward and asked Derek directly, his voice carrying both curiosity and warning. "Coleman," he said, "you understand that stepping into this role today paints a target on your back. Evelyn will not take her humiliation quietly. She will attempt to discredit you, perhaps even destroy you. Are you ready for that fight?" Derek met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, sir," he replied firmly, "because I've been documenting her behavior since the day I started here." Whitaker raised an eyebrow, the faintest sign of surprise flickering across his otherwise impassive face, while Miguel tilted his head with interest and signed quickly for Derek to elaborate. Derek steadied his breath and began, his words measured, his tone controlled but resolute. "From the first week I arrived, Evelyn went out of her way to remind me of my place. She mocked me in meetings when she thought no one important was listening. She sent emails questioning my competence. She told colleagues I was only here for diversity quotas. I knew if I confronted her directly, I would be dismissed as oversensitive, so I did the only thing I could. I documented everything. He reached into his bag and placed a slim black digital recorder on the table, its metallic edge glinting in the sunlight, and then pulled out a leather-bound notebook worn from weeks of use. I have over 40 hours of recordings, he continued, captured in common spaces where she assumed no one cared. I have notes on each incident, time-stamped and corroborated with copies of internal emails. Every insult, every instruction to ignore me, every attempt to sabotage my work is all here. Whitaker's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in keen assessment, as though he were recalculating Derek entirely, and Miguel signed enthusiastically, his gestures conveying admiration. Derek translated aloud. He says you've shown more foresight in 3 months than some executives show in 3 decades. He says you've turned survival into strategy. Whitaker exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. You've been underestimated, he said, and you've used that to your advantage. Derek nodded once, his voice firm. When you grow up being told you're less than, you learn that evidence is stronger than outrage. Outrage can be dismissed, but evidence can't. Miguel signed again, and Derek translated, he wants to know what your next move is. Derek paused for a moment, letting the question settle, then spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had rehearsed this answer in his mind countless times. Evelyn will send emails to the board. She will try to paint me as unqualified, and she will claim favoritism. When she does, I will release the evidence not to the public yet, but to you, Mr. Whitaker, and to the board itself. I want her to know that every word she has said is on record, and that her arrogance was the very thing that exposed her. She thinks I'm naive, that I'm just a kid trying to impress people. She doesn't realize I came prepared for this the day I walked through the door. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was not the silence of doubt. It was the silence of respect. Whitaker's gaze softened just enough to betray something rare, admiration. You remind me of Sarah, he said quietly, almost to himself. She too documented everything when teachers dismissed her or excluded her from opportunities. She always said, if they won't hear me, I'll make sure they can't deny me. And you've done exactly that. Derek swallowed, his chest tightening at the mention of Whitaker's daughter, but he stayed composed because he knew this was more than a personal compliment. It was an alignment, a connection of values that went beyond the corporate ladder. Miguel signed again, his movements sharper now, and Derek translated, he says he believes you're not just an interpreter, you're a strategist, and that's why you belong at this table. Derek felt the truth of those words reverberate through him, but he knew he could not afford to bask in validation. He needed to be clear-eyed, focused, because this was only the beginning of a much larger battle. He placed the recorder and notebook back in his bag, his motions deliberate. I don't want revenge, he said. What I want is accountability. I want to prove that competence and integrity can dismantle arrogance. If Evelyn escalates, she will find out she underestimated the wrong person. Derek Coleman left the boardroom with Miguel Alvarez and Richard Whitaker, his mind still buzzing from the weight of the revelation he had made. The fact that the CEO now knew about his recordings and that Miguel had praised him not as a subordinate but as a strategist. Yet even as he walked, calm on the surface, Derek knew this victory would provoke Evelyn Drake into her most vicious form, because humiliation had a way of igniting vengeance in those who built their power on intimidation. And Evelyn was nothing if not a master at disguising spite as authority. Down on her floor, Evelyn was already working, her manicured nails clattering against her keyboard as she drafted emails with subject lines carefully crafted to sound professional but designed to poison Derek's name. Concerns about favoritism in recent promotion decisions, she typed, her fingers striking the keys with fury, each word dripping with calculated malice. She listed Derek as an intern with no qualifications, accused Whitaker of rushing to place him in a position outside his scope, and implied that the company risked lawsuits or public scandals if employees began to see its interns bypassing proper channels. Her plan was simple: frame Derek as a token hire, paint Whitaker as reckless, and discredit the entire accessibility initiative before it gained traction. But what Evelyn did not know was that Whitaker's oversight system automatically copied her email to his account, a safeguard against exactly this kind of maneuvering. As she hit send, believing she had struck her blow, the very evidence of her treachery slid silently into the CEO's inbox. Derek, meanwhile, sat quietly in the cafeteria corner, sipping coffee, replaying the meeting in his head, rehearsing his next moves. He knew Evelyn would not stop at insults or gossip. She would try to stage a grand assault, one that made him look like a fraud in front of the board. But he was ready. In his bag rested not just recordings, but transcripts, timestamps, and documented patterns of her harassment. Evidence was his shield and his sword, and he would wield it with precision when the time came. Evelyn gathered allies quickly, whispering in hallways, stopping by cubicles, leaning into desks with her saccharine smile and venomous words. "Have you heard about Coleman?" she said to one employee. "He thinks he's some kind of executive now." Imagine that, an intern walking into CEO meetings. If this company starts rewarding arrogance, what does that mean for the rest of us? Some nodded nervously, unwilling to cross her, but others looked doubtful, remembering the scene in the lobby where Derek had handled himself with dignity while Evelyn sneered. Still, Evelyn pressed on, her network of influence spreading like ink through paper. Her final move came when she called for an emergency meeting with the board, demanding to expose what she labeled gross misconduct. She prepared slides, pulled up charts, and rehearsed her speech in the mirror, her eyes gleaming with the anticipation of triumph. She believed the element of surprise was hers, that Derek would walk into the room defenseless, that she would strip him of credibility before he could even speak. But what Evelyn failed to see was that her actions had already been anticipated. Derek had told Whitaker directly that she would try to smear him through the board, and Whitaker, now watching Evelyn through eyes sharpened by grief and renewed purpose, was not just waiting for her to make a mistake, he was counting on it. On the day of the meeting, the boardroom was thick with tension. Evelyn walked in with a confident stride, carrying a sleek folder and a flash drive for her presentation, her heels striking the polished floor like a countdown to war. Derek sat quietly at the far end of the table, his bag by his side, his expression calm, though his hands rested lightly on the recorder he carried like a soldier keeping a hand on his weapon. Miguel sat beside him, his presence both symbolic and practical, because every sign he made, every word Derek translated, added credibility to Derek's role in the room. Whitaker sat at the head of the table, silent, his face carved from stone, waiting. Evelyn began her presentation with practiced precision, her slides glowing on the screen behind her. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice smooth, "we are here because our company faces a serious issue of favoritism that could undermine our reputation." She gestured toward Derek without looking directly at him, her contempt disguised as professionalism. "This intern, in less than 24 hours, has been elevated to a role he is neither trained for nor qualified to hold. This is not meritocracy. This is dangerous precedent." The room shifted uneasily, some board members exchanging uncertain glances. Evelyn pressed harder, her tone sharpening. "We all know that certain hires are made for quotas, not competence. This is one of those cases." The silence that followed was thick, but before Evelyn could move to her next slide, Derek's calm voice interrupted, steady and clear. "With respect, Miss Drake, I'd like to respond." Evelyn froze, caught off guard by his interruption, but Whitaker raised a hand, granting Derek the floor. Derek reached into his bag, pulled out the recorder, and placed it gently in the center of the table. The red light blinked as he pressed play, and Evelyn's voice filled the room, sharp and cruel. "These diversity interns are all the same," her recorded self sneered. "They're hired to fill quotas. They don't know anything, and yet they think they deserve promotions." A chill swept across the room, and several board members stiffened, their eyes narrowing at Evelyn. She leapt to her feet, her voice rising. "That's taken out of context!" But Derek's hand was steady as he pressed another button, releasing more of her venom into the room. "People like him need to learn their place," her voice said coldly. "No matter how many nice gestures he makes, an intern is an intern." The room was stone silent except for the echo of her words. Miguel leaned forward, signing with deliberate precision, and Derek translated aloud. He says, "This is not favoritism. This is accountability." Evelyn's face drained of color as she realized her carefully constructed narrative had crumbled, not because of Derek's ambition, but because of her own arrogance. She had underestimated him, underestimated his preparation, underestimated the power of evidence. Whitaker leaned forward, his voice calm but cutting like steel. The boardroom had fallen into a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the walls themselves, the air charged with the unmistakable shift that happens when power changes hands, and Derek Coleman sat steady at the far end of the table, the small recorder glowing red as it played Evelyn Drake's voice back to her, exposing the venom she had spewed in private for months. Evelyn's face was flushed with panic, her hands trembling as she slammed her palm against the table, trying to regain control of the narrative. "This is out of context," she shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. "These recordings are manipulated. He's twisting everything I said to make me look like a monster." But the words rang hollow, and the faces of the board members around her told the story more clearly than any response Derek could give. They had heard her own voice, unfiltered and uncoached, dripping with disdain for interns, for diversity hires, for anyone who didn't fit her narrow vision of corporate worth. The silence in the room was no longer uncertainty, it was judgment. Richard Whitaker's expression didn't change. His steely eyes locked on Evelyn with the calm of a man who had seen empires crumble and had never once flinched. "Manipulated?" he asked evenly, his tone cutting through her protest like a scalpel. "Are you saying the board can't recognize your voice? Because I assure you, Evelyn, we all just did." Evelyn's lips parted, but no words came out. She faltered, stammering, Those were jokes taken." But Derek pressed another button on the recorder, his hand deliberate, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with her unraveling composure. A new clip filled the room. The little black cleaning lady got promoted to making coffee. Imagine thinking that's progress. Gasps rippled through the room, some of the board members recoiling visibly, others shaking their heads in disgust. Evelyn's eyes widened as though she had forgotten even saying it, her arrogance finally colliding with the reality of consequences. Derek sat silent, his gaze unwavering, letting her own words destroy her. Miguel Alvarez leaned forward, his hands moving sharply, and Derek translated with a steady voice. He says this is not just offensive, this is systemic toxicity, and any partnership with this company is contingent on whether people like this remain in leadership. The weight of Miguel's words fell heavily across the table, the man whose network controlled the very deal Evelyn thought she was protecting, now spelling out in no uncertain terms that she was the liability, not the intern she tried to smear. Evelyn whipped toward Whitaker, her eyes pleading, her voice rising shrill. "You can't believe them over me. I've been loyal to this company for 15 years. He's just an intern. He has no experience. He has no place here." Whitaker rose slowly from his chair, his imposing figure towering over the table, and when he spoke, his voice was calm but thunderous in its authority. "No, Evelyn. What he has is integrity, preparation, and courage. What you have is arrogance, prejudice, and a trail of your own words proving it. You've humiliated this company, and you've humiliated yourself." The security of her title slipped through her fingers as the board members nodded, their expressions resolute. Evelyn, realizing the walls had closed in, made one last desperate gamble, her voice frantic. "If you fire me, I'll go to the press. I'll tell them everything. I'll tell them Whitaker and AMP, Ross is corrupt, that you promote unqualified interns because of quotas." But Whitaker didn't flinch, and Derek knew the trap Evelyn had just walked into without even realizing it. Whitaker tilted his head slightly, his lips curving into the faintest smile. "Funny," he said. "Considering you've already gone to the press, I have copies of your emails to the Chronicle this morning, offering them an exclusive on so-called favoritism. You didn't think we'd find out?" Evelyn froze, her mouth opening in shock, but no sound came out. The color drained from her face as the realization sank in. She had not only failed to destroy Derek, she had handed Whitaker the final nail in her coffin. The silence stretched for a long, unbearable beat until Whitaker spoke again, his voice final, unyielding. "Evelyn Drake, you are terminated effective immediately for cause. Security will escort you from the building, and I strongly suggest you find legal counsel, because what Mr. Coleman has documented is more than enough to justify a discrimination lawsuit that could follow you for the rest of your life." At his signal, the door opened, and 2 security guards stepped in, their presence a physical confirmation of Evelyn's downfall. She shrieked, "This is unfair. You're all blind. He's nothing. He'll ruin this company." Her words echoed, but no one moved to support her. No one met her eyes. She had burned every bridge, and now she stood alone in the wreckage of her arrogance. As she was escorted out, her protests faded down the hallway, and the room exhaled collectively. Derek sat still, his recorder silent now, his face calm but his heart pounding with the knowledge that he had just witnessed the destruction of a woman who had tried to crush him. Miguel clapped slowly, his hands deliberate, and Derek translated. He says you executed justice with precision. You didn't scream. You didn't argue. You let her destroy herself. Whitaker nodded, his gaze steady on Derek. That was a masterclass, Coleman. You've shown this company what accountability looks like. Derek inclined his head, but he didn't smile. There was no triumph in him, only the quiet satisfaction of someone who had fought back with truth and won. He knew this was only one battle. Not the war, but it was the battle that changed everything. The boardroom still echoed with the memory of Evelyn Drake's shrill protests as the heavy door closed behind her. And in that silence, Derek Coleman sat steady, his hands folded on the table, the weight of what had just unfolded pressing into him but not crushing him. He could feel the eyes of the board members on him, eyes that only hours ago had dismissed him as a coffee-carrying intern. But now those same eyes saw him as the man who had held up a mirror to one of their own and forced them to see the rot festering in their company. Richard Whitaker leaned back in his chair, his gaze unwavering, his voice calm but full of finality. Gentlemen and ladies, you have just witnessed what integrity looks like. Coleman is no longer just an intern. He is an asset this company cannot afford to lose. Derek's chest tightened at the words, but he stayed composed, his posture respectful yet firm, understanding that moments like this define the trajectory of a life. Miguel Alvarez signed slowly, his movements carrying the gravity of a man who knew the importance of legacy. And Derek translated aloud, he says this is not just about one company or one executive. This is about setting a precedent that kindness and courage can reshape corporate culture more than fear ever could. The words hung in the air, and Derek realized their truth with a clarity that made his breath catch. The fight had not been about him proving his worth alone. It had been about proving that integrity could exist in a place built on facades, that compassion could thrive in a world hardened by ambition, that justice could outlast arrogance. Whitaker nodded slowly, his voice dropping with the weight of memory. My daughter Sarah always told me inclusion wasn't about numbers or quotas. It was about dignity. Today, Coleman, you gave this company a lesson she would have been proud of. From this day forward, the Sarah Initiative will fund scholarships for students from marginalized communities, and you, Coleman, will help lead it. Not as a symbol, but as a partner. Derek swallowed hard, his mind reeling with the enormity of the moment, but he kept his voice steady. I accept, sir, but only if we make this more than a program. It has to be a movement. It has to be something that changes how people see each other, not just here, but across every company we touch. Whitaker's lips curved into the faintest smile, a smile of recognition, not triumph. Miguel signed again, his hands firm and deliberate, and Derek's voice carried his words across the room. He says you are no longer fighting for yourself. You are fighting for everyone who has ever been dismissed, ignored, or underestimated. In that instant, Derek felt the weight of generations pressing into him. All the times people like him had been told to stay invisible, to keep their heads down, to accept less. He thought of his younger cousin, deaf and overlooked in school, who had taught him that communication was not a skill but a lifeline. He thought of the humiliation he had swallowed in the first months of his internship, when Evelyn mocked him in hallways and supervisors pretended not to hear. He thought of the visitor in the lobby, his eyes lighting up when he finally found someone who understood his language. And he realized the truth that tied it all together. Every act of kindness had been a seed, and today those seeds had bloomed into something undeniable. 6 months later, the transformation of Whitaker and Amp, Ross was evident not just in profit margins, but in the culture that pulsed through its halls. Derek walked through the lobby where it had all begun, now redesigned with braille plaques, ramps, and sign language posters mounted on the walls as part of the accessibility program he had co-created. Employees greeted him not with dismissive glances, but with nods of respect, some stopping to sign simple greetings they had learned in workshops he had initiated. The same security guard who had watched silently on that first day gave him a subtle salute as he passed, a gesture of acknowledgement that spoke volumes. Derek's office overlooked the skyline, a plaque on his door reading Director of Accessibility and Inclusion, but the title mattered less to him than the impact. His brotherly bond with his cousin deepened as he used his position to advocate for schools and programs across the state, ensuring no child would grow up feeling unseen. Miguel Alvarez remained a close ally, together expanding the initiative nationwide, while Whitaker often reminded him quietly, Sarah would have wanted this. But Derek knew his greatest victory was not in titles or recognition. It was in the message that spread far beyond the walls of Whitaker and Amp. Ross, the story of a black intern who refused to stay silent when faced with injustice, who turned humiliation into strategy, who used truth instead of rage, evidence instead of excuses, and compassion instead of cruelty. That story traveled through corporate circles, universities, and conferences, whispered in hallways and spoken on stages, a story that told others what Derek himself had learned, that the smallest act of courage can ripple into the largest transformation. Evelyn Drake's name became a cautionary tale, a case study in business schools on how arrogance and prejudice destroy careers faster than incompetence ever could. Derek's name became the opposite, a symbol of resilience, of preparation, of the quiet power of standing firm when silence is expected. On the anniversary of Sarah's passing, Whitaker stood beside Derek at the launch of the Sarah Initiative, his voice breaking slightly as he said, "In honoring my daughter's memory, we honor every voice that has ever been silenced." And in Derek Coleman, we found the proof that those voices can rise. Derek stepped to the podium, looking out at the audience of executives, employees, students, and advocates. His words calm but firm. "I was once told that interns are meant to be invisible, that people like me are meant to know our place. But I've learned that our place is not defined by arrogance or prejudice. Our place is wherever we choose to stand with courage, wherever we refuse to be silent, wherever we use truth to break the chains of injustice. And when we do, we don't just change our lives, we change the lives of everyone who comes after us." The applause rose like thunder, but Derek didn't bask in it. He thought of the visitor in the lobby, the first man he had signed for, and how that single decision had ignited everything. He thought of Sarah Whitaker, who had taught her father that communication connects souls, and how her legacy now lived on in every policy, every workshop, every life touched by the initiative. He thought of his cousin, now thriving in college with full support, and he smiled knowing that the seeds had indeed bloomed. The end was not just the end of Evelyn's cruelty, the end. If this story moved you, make sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'd love to know what part of Derek's journey stood out the most to you. Was it the moment he stood up in the lobby, the strategy he revealed in the boardroom, or the way he turned injustice into a lasting legacy? Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know where in the world you're watching from. Your voice matters here, just like Derek's did in that boardroom.